Hello, everyone. Welcome to the EU Renew webinar series on Europe and the world. I'm Carrie Otterburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be your host and moderator. Today, we are joined by Professor Mark Purdon, who will discuss his new book, The Political Economy of Climate Finance Effectiveness in Developing Countries, which was published this year in 2020, or published in 2024. Sorry, that's not this year anymore, by Oxford University Press. Mark is professor at the École des Sciences de la Gestion at the University of Quebec at Montreal, and he is an expert in the emerging field of comparative environmental politics, which combines elements of comparative politics, comparative public policy, and international relations. He is particularly interested in the relationship between climate change and policy, climate change policy and political economy with extensive research experience in both the developing and developed worlds. He has also actively participated in nearly every conference of the parties of the United Nations Forum on Climate Change since 2005. Also joining us today as discussant is Sarah Thompson. Sarah is Senior Research Program Manager of the European Chair for Sustainable Development and Climate Transition at Sciences Po. She is also completing a PhD in political science at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, focusing on global climate governance and climate finance. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Mark for approximately 30 minutes, and then we will turn to Sarah to kick off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking a few questions. And then we will turn to you, the audience, for your questions. So feel free to send those questions to me during the webinar by using the Q&A function, and I will share them with the speakers at the right moment. Before we begin, just a few words about the EU Renew project. The EU Research and Education Network on Europe and the World, or EU Renew as we call it, is an Erasmus Jean Monnet network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in an ever-changing world. On behalf of EU Renew, I would like to thank Mark and Sarah for joining us today, and it is now my great pleasure to pass the floor over to Mark.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to EU Renew for organizing a webinar. You've already kind of gotten a bit of an introduction on me. So the book I'll be presenting, again, is titled Political Economy of Climate Finance, Effectiveness in Developing Countries, Carbon Markets, Climate Funds, and the State. Let's see if I can get this to work. So the book is responding to what I think is a really important debate on climate finance and climate finance instruments in particular. There's a lot of interest in engaging developing countries on climate change mitigation, as well as adaptation. We know adaptation is equally quite important. And there's an understanding, especially on the mitigation side, that the more players we can engage in a meaningful way, this could kind of create a sort of synergistic effect and kind of spread out the costs and accelerate the transition, global transition towards decarbonization. And just to emphasize that we're talking about major transformational change. We need to kind of eliminate half of the greenhouse gas emissions globally by 2030, if not 2040. So there's like a real incentive to kind of accelerate the transition. But as some of you who are perhaps following the climate policy space, you know that there's a lot of debate about how the most effective strategy for engagement and how to unlock these low-cost mitigation opportunities. And I make a distinction in the book between carbon markets and climate funds. And I'm sure some of you might be familiar with the Clean Development Mechanism, or some of you might have purchased carbon offsets when you're for compensating for flights or other kind of emissions that associated with our Western lifestyles. And there's a lot of debate as to how effective these things are and if they're really doing what they claim to be doing. And I guess my read of this literature over the years has been that there's really not a lot of empirical research on the issue of effectiveness. There's some more econometric studies that are coming out recently, but overall, I find that there's certainly not enough, I think, to kind of have a really good informed debate about issues. So just to kind of put things in context, when I talk about climate finance here, I mean cross-border financial flows triggered by public and or private intervention. And sometimes climate finance has begun to have an association with just public finance, but for the purposes of this book, it's really focusing on both public and private. And we know that there's been the clean development mechanism recently supplanted by the sustainable development mechanism at COP29 in Baku. But the clean development mechanism is really recognized as the kind of most salient carbon offset system globally. It was really only operational under the Kyoto Protocol. But there still has attracted a large literature and attention. I distinguish the clean development mechanism in the book from RED, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and also another instrument called NAMAs, nationally appropriate mitigation actions. Now, both RED and NAMAs, I'm considering them under the UN FCC rules. RED exists on the voluntary carbon market, but I'm not talking about that form of RED. RED and NAMAs kind of evolved in the mid-2000s. And there was initially some thinking that they might be adhere to a carbon market approach. But as I kind of explain later and in more detail in the book, they were kind of all dissociated from carbon markets after the 2009 climate finance conference in Copenhagen. And so RED and NAMAs, as they've been implemented under the UNFCCC, have been largely implemented as kind of climate fund approaches with funding coming from largely public ODA. Anyway, I kind of treat all these three climate finance instruments as building blocks in nationally determined contributions, national climate plans under the Paris Agreement. Even though they were not initially intended in that regard. But I think if you actually look at the NDCs, there's often reference to some of these instruments. So the two research questions I look at are, under what conditions have these various instruments been effective in reducing emissions? And the literature that I've kind of been most aware of has suggested that effectiveness is linked to state capacity. And we can talk about state capacity in a bit more, and we'll unpack that. But the other suggestion is that some instruments have been more effective than others. And RED Plus and NAMAs kind of emerged in their current form as a result of critiques of the CDM and the carbon offset approach, carbon market approach that the CDM represented. And there's sort of an assumption, I think, that climate funds are more effective than carbon markets in this regard. So those are my two research questions. But the shift from carbon markets, the CDM, to climate funds represented by RED and NAMAs, I think is sort of indicative of a broader shift in global environmental norms. And I talk about a shift, I argue for a shift from liberal environmentalism to what I'm calling developmental environmentalism. And the key inflection point, or the key critical juncture, was the global financial crisis in 2008. And this kind of precipitated a delegitimization of neoliberal economic ideas. So the liberal environmentalism was built on the assumption that we needed to kind of create global environmental governance that mapped onto or fit with the neoliberal economic order. But I think I argue effectively in the book is that this neoliberal economic order has been dissolving since 2008. This was kind of integrated into the Copenhagen Accords in 2009, and it's been built out into something that I call developmental environmentalism. And I think that this is kind of been snowballing actually with Trump and Trump 2 and the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States and some other things. So we can maybe return to this dissection if there's some questions. Yeah, so this idea of the CDM represents this kind of liberal environmental norm where environmentalism is viewed as part of the needs to fit with neoliberal international economic order to gain traction. And that's why these kind of market-based approaches are privileged. And there's some other things here. Importantly, there's a reduced role for the state in environmental policy, and really an emphasis on private capital flows for financing transition. And this is just, I think, an interesting slide. I kind of dedicated a chapter or two actually to this trend shift from liberal environmentalism to developmental environmentalism. And I think what's really interesting in this graph, it shows that globalization in terms of flows of global goods, services, and finance as a percent of GDP sort of peaks in 2008, just before the financial crisis. So it'd be interesting to update these figures, but I think the 2000 financial crisis serves as a critical juncture in global environmental politics, if not global international political economy altogether. So I contrast liberal environmentalism with developmental environmentalism. And in terms of the main source of funding, developmental environmentalism privileges public funds, especially ODA. It also privileges the state, whereas for the CDM, the state played a very limited role. And for RED and NAMAs, that's an essential partner. And also the evaluation framework. Now, evaluation framework is a term that I use to, some people in the climate policy space might be aware of the measurement, reporting, and verification, MRV, but I don't like that language. And I prefer to use evaluation frameworks because there's some confusion on what MRV really refers to if we're talking about evaluating outcomes or transparency. There's some distinctions to be made. And my evaluation frameworks, how I'm using it is really kind of drawing attention to causal relationships, and we are able to demonstrate causality. And so the CDM had a result-based management approach, which is seeking market fungibility. Right? Now, there's lots of questions of whether the CDM credits generated represent genuine emission reductions, but that's the aim. Whereas when we look at how RED and NAMAs have been implemented, they've kind of had a softer take on results-based management, and it's kind of reverting to more traditional approach to international cooperation. And there's an independence of carbon markets, so the questions about fungibility kind of aren't present. So a bit more detail. So I've argued about the importance of the 2008 financial crisis, but this was consolidated. This kind of emphasis on public climate funds. It dovetailed with efforts to revive the global economy after the global financial crisis. We have stimulus funding being provided by governments around the world, and that kind of dovetailed with this kind of reliance on public funds to finance decarbonization and adaptation efforts in developing countries. And perhaps some of you know about the commitment first made in Copenhagen, in the Copenhagen Accords, for 100 billion per year in climate finance from public and private sources, bilateral and multilateral. And also important, it's supposed to be increased, new, and additional, predictable, and adequate. There's some questions of whether all this is new and additional. We'll talk about that later. Also in Copenhagen, you have the establishment of the Green Climate Fund. So in 2009, I think there's this kind of, okay, let's kind of reorientate the international climate regime towards more of a fund-based approach, and also kind of carbon markets drop out of the Copenhagen Accord. They brought back in the Paris Agreement, but that's not for another 6 years. So the rise of climate funds, the 2022 goal was apparently attained in 2022 behind schedule. What's I think interesting is 80% of this goal is being provided by ODA. And if you look at the historical trends in ODA, climate finance now represents about 50% of total ODA from the OECD, emerging from about 0 in 2013, as well. Not 0, but close to almost nothing about 10 years ago. So it's really, I think there's some important questions to be had about whether ODA is really new and additional for climate change, but we can talk about that later. After Copenhagen, after the financial crisis, these are prices of on the CDM carbon market. We see a drop after the financial crisis, some reestablishment at $15 a ton, but then they dropped to really 0 in 2013. And so with the CDM market evaporating, sort of the climate funds approach becomes more attractive. We see this dotted line as a voluntary carbon market, and that kind of the prices have surpassed the regulated CDM carbon offset market, which explains to maybe some of the interest in the voluntary income market, I think. The other issue I mentioned is the state as an essential partner. And so RED and NAMAS, if you look at the history of their negotiations, which I outlined in the book, it was they were both initially proposed this national approach as a means of addressing technical issues of additionality and linkage. Sort of arguments such as for RED was that at a national level, sort of project-based additionality evaluations would be easier to do. But what began as a technical justification for the state in establishing RED baselines, it quickly expanded to a broader set of governance functions. And so this publication by C4 in 2009 says achieving RED plus presupposes a national architecture or governance structure. And that's like language we really didn't see with regard to the CDM. And of course, for nationally appropriate mitigation actions, nationally appropriate is in the term. And there's often a sort of I remember sitting on a government or a panel organized by the UNDP in 2013 and 14, which kind of tried to get a lot of government players and other civil society members together to kind of identify these nationally appropriate mitigation actions. The last kind of thing, characteristic of a developmental environmentalist identify is softening of the evaluation of variance. And here I get a bit into the technical weeds of how evaluation frameworks are going to work for the CDM, RED plus, and NAMAS. And so off the bat, RED plus and NAMAS are associated with carbon markets. So the emphasis on fungibility kind of is not there. And there's this return to traditional development cooperation approaches. So you see the World Bank and the UNDP sort of kind of playing a key role. One reason for the key role of sort of the multilateral development agencies is that the UNFCCC was really kind of not able to provide concrete guidance in how to measure policy effectiveness. So it's most evident with NAMAS. Wasn't clear for, maybe never been clear if they're supposed to target emission reductions, emission mitigation actions. There's a lot of emphasis on readiness, and introducing RED readiness was sort of a phase of the UN RED approach to supporting RED in developing countries. But there's been some insufficiency on what we're actually trying to do with these new climate finance instruments, because if they're not producing emission reductions for carbon markets, should we still be aiming for emission reductions? And then there's also questions about how to include transformational change. I think what's also interesting in the book is just how the multilateral development agencies kind of try and step into the breach here and complete and kind of take leadership when the UNFCCC isn't able to provide leadership on how to operationalize these instruments. They try and do that. And the World Bank, at least for RED, I think is introduced a stricter system than the UN RED, the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility of the World Bank, anticipates a carbon market, but it doesn't, it doesn't represent a carbon market itself. What's also interesting, NAMAS, the World Bank hasn't been involved really with them at all. And they're really being implemented with the support of the UNDP and also an international agency called the NAMA facility. I think it's now called the NDC facility. Anyway, so there's this softening in the evaluation frameworks and sort of loosening of the causal requirements to demonstrate additionality and whether effectiveness is being achieved. So you have this large transition from liberal environmentalism to developmental environmentalism. RED and NAMAS have been arguably implemented to kind of correct some of the perceived failures of the carbon market approach of the CDM. But how's this working out on the ground? That's sort of where I'm coming to with the paper, with the book, sorry. And so this is where my comparative study comes in. And I compared Tanzania, Uganda, and Moldova. And I conducted empirical in-country fieldwork from 2008 to 2018. Initial field visit in 2009 during my PhD, 8 months of fieldwork. visited a number of projects, bought my first car, drove around Tanzania, Uganda, and Moldova. And many household surveys, lots of interviews with key informants. Returned to Moldova, Tanzania, Uganda, 2013, 2014, 2018, to do some more interviews, to explore red enemas. CDM, as we'll show you in a moment, has been actively been implemented, but red enemas have sort of only been in the process of being implemented. My three case study countries, I think, are interesting because they represent a sort of an important variation in different political economy factors. We can think of state organizational capacity, political settlements, which is sort of a distribution of power in developing countries. We talk about political settlements as sort of a key way of considering power and institutions in the developing world. I also focus on state development interests. These are policy objectives that the state leaders seek to achieve. I inferred this from reading development plans of all these countries over this 10, 20-year period. Actually, I think some of the state development interests, I kind of go back into the history. I focus on forests and renewable energy as two sectors where I try and see what state interests emerge. The last kind of factor are something I call policy paradigms. And these are ideas about how to govern the economy in order to achieve development goals. And I think this has been one of the more interesting, innovative parts of the book because I identify a number of different development policy paradigms. So if I start at the bottom of this graph here, I distinguish between liberal neo-developmentalism in Uganda and Moldova from a hybrid classic developmentalism, neo-developmentalism in Tanzania. And it's at this level of distinction that I think we see explanation of the effectiveness of these policy instruments. There's some mapping on, there's some influence of interaction with how state development interests emerge in developing countries. What's interesting is I think Tanzania is not very interested in forests, especially additional forests. I think there's a feeling in Tanzania, at least during the period I was there, that there was sufficient forest plantations, and actually not much interest in decentralized renewables, solar and wind in Tanzania because of offshore natural gas and large-scale hydro. Similar situation on the energy side in Uganda, but Uganda is kind of contrast because there's a high interest in forest because there's kind of a dearth of industrial forests, plantations for historical reasons, and also just a sort of an awareness that forest resources are scarce across the country. In Moldova, what's interesting is that there's a scarcity of forest and land degradation is a serious issue in Moldova. There's also a lot of interest in decentralized renewables. And this is because Moldova is very dependent on, it doesn't have many indigenous energy resources and it imports a lot of its electricity from outside, including a significant portion comes from the Transnistria region, which is sort of, if you know, the situation in Moldova, but it's sort of a breakaway section of Moldova that has a strong Russian footprint. I'm not going to dwell on the political settlements of state capacity, but they kind of differ from Tanzania, Uganda, and Moldova in an important way. What's, I think, interesting is that kind of overarching theory that state capacity should be associated with climate finance effectiveness. Moldova, as a former country of the Soviet Union, former republic of the Soviet Union, can anticipate to have higher state capacity than Tanzania and Uganda. Sorry, I'm going to skip to this. I want to kind of make up a bit on time. So I talk about these development policy paradigms, and I think what's important here is to distinguish between policy paradigms that are geared towards autarky and those that are geared towards globalization. And after, upon independence, many developing countries embarked on classic developmentalism, characterized by import substitution, industrialization, whereas that kind of was contested into the 1970s and 80s, and in many countries was replaced by neoliberalism, which I don't think needs any further elaboration. But we saw in many East Asian economies an approach to development that we can characterize as neo-developmentalism. And that was sort of this kind of emphasis on fine countries' comparative advantage, but doing this in a way that's oriented towards exports and towards the global economy. And I think one of the interesting arguments of the book is to identify something between neo-developmentalism and neoliberalism, which I call liberal neo-developmentalism. And that's sort of seeking to strike a balance between defining its comparative advantage strategy of a country and sort of just following what the market trends and its current capacities are. So I mentioned that effectiveness varies across these climate policy instruments. One way of decomposing effectiveness is different stages of the policy process. So NAMAs are sort of at the initial stage. It exists really mostly as paper documents, administrative acts delimiting political intervention. Fortunately, most of the NAMAs that were submitted sort of as paper tigers. There's not much financing associated with them. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that NAMAs haven't been successful. Not many people have been talking about them. RED Plus, as I suggested, has been in the process of being implemented. But in none of my countries, Tanzania and Uganda, where RED was being pursued, was it fully implemented during the 2008 to 2018 period that I investigated. And the results or outputs that we say are associated with CDM, and that's the emission reductions or sequestration. They're meeting this additionality criterion. They're additional to what would have happened if the CDM wasn't there. And so that justifies the field work that I did. I visited all these projects to really understand the development context in which they were situated. Just to give you an example of some of these CDM projects, because sometimes people find this interesting. You have reforestation, biomass for heating in Moldova, improved cook stoves in Tanzania. The most sophisticated one I saw was a biomass cogeneration plant in Uganda, where some of the sugarcane bagasse, the waste residue after sugarcane processing, was used to produce renewable electricity that was exported onto Uganda's grid. So returning to these research questions, first question is, under what conditions have various instruments been effective in reducing emissions? And do we see this state capacity argument, is it justified? The argument would it be that Moldova is more effective than Tanzania and Uganda? And for the second question, it would be the hypothesis is that RED and AMIS are more effective than CDM. But the main conclusions I arrive at, and I don't get into the detail in this presentation, is that what's striking is that climate finance instruments were more effectively implemented in Moldova and Uganda than in Tanzania. And this suggests that state capacity is not the explaining the difference here, because Uganda was actually doing a pretty good job of implementing these instruments. And the other interesting finding is that there's no distinction between the policy and the instruments in terms of their in-country effectiveness. The CDM was being effectively implemented, and not in all cases, but in certain cases, especially in the forest sector in Uganda and Moldova. And Uganda was also implementing RED relatively effectively. I think it's increasingly recognized what Uganda's approach to RED has been very, very effective. And also for NAMAs. Uganda and Moldova were pursuing NAMAs. Moldova very emphatically, they submitted a number of NAMAs to UNFCCC. Uganda identified at least 8. Tanzania hasn't been interested in NAMAs. And Tanzania for RED, so a lot of development partners have sought to promote RED in Tanzania. And during interviews in 2014 and validating 2018, a lot of those key RED partners withdrew from Tanzania, including, I believe, Norway. And then when I was looking at the CDM in Tanzania, there wasn't any real examples of highly effective CDM projects, where there were a few in Uganda and Moldova. So the argument that I arrived at is that the domestic political economy is essential, at least when carbon prices are low. So you saw the carbon prices on the previous slide with those CDM projects. And for RED, I believe the prices offered by the World Bank Forest Carbon Partnership Facility is sort of a gauge what the World Bank was gauging as a price for effective policy RED implementation. They're offering $5 a ton. These prices are very low, quite low. And so under those conditions, it seems that you need some combination of development policy paradigms and state interests to generate policy effectiveness. And so climate finance is used more effectively when states use it to pursue pre-existing development interests. This is really clearly the case in the forest sector in Moldova and Uganda, whereas I integrated both those countries, the state, central governments recognize the importance of forest resources, and they try and implement. They're implementing a number of different policies. And then when the CDM or RED or NAMAs, Moldova is trying to do a forestry NAMA as well. When these countries are seeking to implement these types of development projects, and they see a new form of financing, whether it's from carbon markets or climate funds, well, they go for it. Whereas Tanzania, because of its different development policy paradigm, it's more skeptical of these sorts of forms of international cooperation. And climate fund or carbon market just wasn't really prepared to engage in an effective way. So this is there's a bit of a silver lining. You can identify some of the conditions where climate finance instruments are effective, but the conditions seem to be quite limited, at least at those low carbon prices as I indicated. So where can we go with this? I kind of try to conclude the book on a sort of an upbeat note. And I wonder if the global international community might want to kind of shift towards a new global environmental norm that combines elements of liberalism and developmentalism. And so the main source of financing should try and do a more effective way of combining public and private resources. And one idea here is to create carbon price floors set at transformative levels. Sort of the way carbon prices are kind of understood is that they're kind of informed by the market, but sort of the market kind of can drive towards the least cost opportunities, and how those opportunities are structured is, I think, a bit open to debate, and whether the market's actually able to identify them. And maybe governments should step in developing countries and say, you know, this is the price that we want for these emissions reductions in the sector. And that could be a role for these carbon price floors. Role for a state seeking a more constructive relationship between state and non-state actors. Seems to be a kind of a polarization between, you know, transnational climate governance. Now we see its return of industrial policy, green industrial policy. But this needs to be kind of done in a kind of a smart way to kind of build some synergies between those two groups of stakeholders. In evaluation frameworks, I think the CDM framework, I think it kind of has attracted a lot of attention because people want results. And it's not clear that NAMAs in particular have been so unclear as to what they're trying to do. They haven't attracted much support from the international community because no one was really clear what they were going to do. And there's a whole debate about sort of the CDM, and now we can maybe talk about sustainable development mechanism of the Paris Agreement, Article 6.4, I believe. And those baseline instruments, you know, they're always going to have this sort of problematic kind of counterfactual approach. And so one of the things I wonder is about maybe a transition to emissions trading in different sectors of developing countries could be an option. I think Moldova is moving towards an emissions trading system that might be linked with the EU. But you can even think about, Tanzania and Uganda. You can do emissions trading in maybe sectors of their economy where the data is relatively robust, and we can have comprehensive information on the extent of emissions in those sectors. Maybe not the land use sector itself, but maybe some certain sectors. So I think that's all I have for you. And sorry for going a little over a half hour, but hope everything is okay. And looking to comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. This is a very informative overview of your book, and I think that it's very timely and relevant and has a strong policy relevance. So I hope that the audience found it interesting and you see how you can order it. We'll now turn over to Sarah Thompson, who will kick off our discussion, and then we'll go back to Mark for his response and before the audience Q&A. So I'd just like to remind the audience that you can send your questions now via the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we'll pick those up in just a bit. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks so much. And thank you so much, Mark. This was a really interesting presentation and a really interesting book as well. As Carrie was saying, it's very timely. And I know with COP29 just a few months ago, it was being called the Finance COP. So as you may know, there's a new finance goal being agreed upon. And so climate finance, I think, is really top of the agenda on UN climate negotiations, particularly at this point. I think it was also really interesting what you said, that there's a real significant lack of field-based empirical research, especially in developing countries. It's kind of surprising in a way, especially that we tend to be a little bit evaluation focused sometimes, and especially with how much climate finance is being mobilized. I mean, some could say that it could be and should be probably higher than what we have right now, but nevertheless, there's still quite a bit of finance being mobilized. And yet we still don't quite understand the best way to use it. So I think just as an overall point, I think your book offers a really interesting contribution to help us understand how to make climate finance more effective, or under what conditions it can be more effective. And I think this is especially important right now, particularly if you look at some of the recent climate negotiations. This topic of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in developing countries is becoming a bit more of a sticking point. A lot of developed countries are trying to now push developing countries to reduce more, make more effort, whereas in the past it was a little bit more focused on the historic emitters, or developed countries should be the main ones leading the way, but now it seems to be trying to share the burden. So trying to find the best way to use climate finance seems to be a very pertinent topic. The first thing I just wanted to very quickly touch on, because I personally find it very interesting, it also relates to my own personal research, is just the very simple idea of how do we define policy effectiveness. And I think the book goes into a lot of really interesting detail about this. I think you have a very thoughtful overview of how effectiveness has been defined by other people, by previous studies. It can touch on things like compliance with rules. It can be progress just towards solving a collective action problem. It could be the relative improvement over the absence of the policy, so kind of like a counterfactual. So I think there's so many different ways to actually think about what effectiveness means, and I think you do a really good job of highlighting these different aspects, and also touching on sort of this idea of additionality, and whether the sort of a project or something that's using climate finance, is it actually doing something that wouldn't have existed beforehand? I think you mentioned, for example, there was an afforestation project in Tanzania that in the end they received climate finance, but they were probably going to do it anyway. So can we really count that as something being effective? So I think this is something, I mean, it's kind of the idea that underpins your book. It's really talking about the effectiveness of climate finance. What we mean by effective, I think, is a really good point. And you also highlighted that for these three different policy instruments that you were looking at, the idea of effectiveness is already a bit different within each of those. They have different indicators, and they also probably evolve over time how we define effectiveness. So this was just kind of a brief point that I think is interesting, but it seems very straightforward, but it's quite nuanced in the end. The other thing I wanted to touch on is this idea, and I think it's kind of one of your main contributions, and I think it's really the theoretical underpinning of your book, is this idea of the development policy paradigm, and really kind of drawing a distinction between the neo-developmental approach and the liberal neo-developmental approach. It's a mouthful. Because I think you're really talking about how different ideas about economic development are shaping a state's capacity to effectively manage climate finance. And it's not necessarily the question of the state's capacity itself. So I think that already is quite a compelling finding from your research, that it's not always evident, I think. And so going back to this idea of what is the development policy paradigm, I mean, they're not very, it sounds like something abstract, but it's really, I think, how you interpret it or how you use it in your book. You're really using concrete things, so concrete policies, the institutions, the organizations that a state is establishing. And so it really kind of also highlights the real rich empirical research that you've done and that you highlighted as well, all the surveys, the different interviews, and all the different other types of sources where you're getting your data. It just kind of shows how much was going into your idea of the development policy paradigm. So I thought that was very interesting. I'm just going to skip ahead through my notes because I know we don't have a lot of time. Then the last thing I just wanted to mention about this kind of distinction between liberal neo-developmental paradigm is, I think it kind of challenges the idea that states often are pressed with this choice between either you choose economic development or you choose environmental sustainability. But I think what your research is showing is that they're not actually mutually exclusive. So I think this is quite an important finding, actually, that these things can go together. I won't go on to too many other points because I know we're running out of time. So maybe if I can, I'll just go to a question or two. I have many, but I can, I'll limit myself. So the first one is, so that you have this main conclusion about the conditions under which climate finance is more effective, and it's less to do with the structure of the policy instrument, and it's more to do with the characteristics of the state itself. So I'm curious, like how sticky, if I can say, is a state's developmental paradigm? So you mentioned, for example, that state interest could be really slow to change. You also highlight Tanzania's first president, Julius Nyerere, for example, and his real long-lasting influence on their sort of classic and neo-developmental hybrid model that we still see today. So there can clearly be these long-term effects of their developmental paradigm, maybe being slow to evolve. So in light of this, what would you say could be some key sort of policy takeaways for your findings, knowing that it's not actually the way climate finance is given, it's more to do with the state itself? I don't know, I can leave you to answer that, or if I could go to my second question and then I stop.
Whatever is appropriate.
Okay. Maybe go on to your second question and then we can turn over to Mark's.
Okay, perfect. I was reading recently, there was a study coming out of Oxford that analyzed, I think it was about 1,500 policies around the world, maybe in 60 or so countries, to see what were actually effective in reducing emissions. And one of the findings that they found were, first of all, there were not very many out of these 1,500. There was about 60, I think, that they found to be truly effective. But that there were differences between developed and developed countries. So in developed countries, they found carbon pricing was to be considered effective, whereas in developing countries, regulation was found to be the most powerful policy. So taking this into consideration, and given that your research focuses on three specific case studies that exhibit particular characteristics such as varying levels of state capacity, political settlements, and development policy paradigms, I'm wondering if you have a sense of how your findings and the concept of liberal developmental environmentalism could translate to other countries, particularly those with maybe very different contexts. I'm thinking maybe least developed countries with very low state capacity, or even emerging economies, high emitting emerging economies that have a comparative advantage in carbon intensive industries. So how could your findings essentially be replicated in these very different contexts? But then I stop there. Thank you again.
And so should I
Yep.
should I
Over
respond
to
or?
yes, over to you, Mark. Go ahead.
Well, I think the first question about the stickiness of the development policy paradigms, I'll be honest, I probably could have published this book. I published an initial paper on my CDM research in a paper in 2015. And I was not, I was like, this is the discourse around RED and NAMAs was so overwhelmingly that these things are going to be very different, and when operationalized on the ground is going to lead to different outcomes. I was a bit hesitant. I went back in 2013, 14. I was like, okay, but things haven't changed, but I still wasn't sure. I went back in 2018. And I think the fact that these development policy paradigms don't change that much or are very slow to change, I think that's something of a surprise for me. But I think it's a key finding that it just kind of speaks to the power and the agency of developing countries on these fundamental matters of their own sort of development. So how easy is it to change development policy paradigms? I guess my feeling is they're not easy to change. So there's a sort of the literature on climate policy and international relations, normative ideas are sort of an opportunity, are more easy to change than maybe interests. But I think this book is, at least my findings are suggesting that some ideas are difficult to change as well. Although there were some interesting changes during the kind of the historical kind of review of the development policy paradigms that I provide. But turning to your other question about the Oxford study, I'm willing, quite interested to read that. My feeling is the distinction between regulation and carbon pricing. It has to be borne in mind that the way these policy instruments are being implemented in developing countries, we kind of associate them with carbon markets, maybe the CDM, but it's really a project. How they're kind of introduced in developed countries is sort of a project-based subsidy. For RED, it's maybe some sort of subsidy. It's not really it's not introducing a carbon price that's supposed to then change the behavior of economic actors. So it's just sort of like the distinction between carbon pricing and regulation. I'm not sure if that kind of is the best way of distinguishing between these different instruments in these developing country contexts, because carbon pricing, it's not like a emissions trading system which you have in Europe, where all the firms are kind of confronted with it. Sort of been more and more targeted subsidies. But happy to discuss, happy to read that paper. Replication, transfer to other countries. I mean, I guess I kind of gauge this, all these countries, Moldova included, are highly rural. I don't know if Moldova is sort of one of the poorest countries, if not the poorest country in Europe. Largely rural, large peasant populations, which has all sorts of implications for replication. So I kind of make an argument about maybe this could be expanded. These dynamics could be tested in sort of similar countries. I don't know, Azerbaijan maybe as a former Soviet Republic versus Armenia, Georgia. That's sort of something I thought would be interesting. Azerbaijan has a lot more oil resources clearly than Moldova does, so there's probably a big difference to be found there. So yeah, I kind of have some questions about how much the results resonate with other countries. But I think maybe, and tying in with that Oxford study, it would be interesting if we could kind of develop some sort of index of development policy paradigms, and then see if some sort of calibration of different countries in terms of some development policy paradigm index, can be used to explain large, effectiveness in the large and universal cases. But anyway, so there's lots of future research to be done, and I hope I respond to your questions and happy to talk more, and I appreciate the feedback.
Thank you very much. We'll go on to some questions from the audience in the time that we have left. So first one is asking, while outside the scope of your case study countries, maybe you could speak to the intersection of climate finance and renewable energy financing and conflict, specifically in fragile and conflict-affected states. Are you familiar with financing fueling conflict in states with low capacity, and are there ways to mitigate this or space for future research, perhaps? And then, of course, we have to bring up the T word for the next 4 years, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your views on that. But what impact do you think the Trump administration is going to have on the balance of public and private financing? Do you think that's going to adjust at all the idea of the state and as an essential partner in the climate change battle? And I don't know, maybe we already have some experience with the previous Trump administration. Do you think there could be another shift given the Trump administration's aversion to international cooperation? And then finally, if we have time, which we may not, maybe we can discuss a little bit more into your methods, particularly how you went about establishing causality. I know you mentioned that a few different times. If you could talk more about how you did that, and what kind of information were you getting from these household interviews and surveys that you embarked upon, and maybe you could discuss some of the indicators you use to assess the political economy variations. I'm not sure if we're gonna have time for that last one, but we'll see where we're at. Back over to you.
Yeah, thanks. The issue of conflict, trying to think back to, it wasn't as evident in my field work as I think it's suggested in the literature. There was, I believe, one forest project in Uganda where there had been an effort to include the rural kind of communities in it, but one of the rural communities had encroached on the forest reserve that was targeted for the carbon offset project, and that there was some conflict around that. I think some seedlings were removed after plantation. I'm just trying to think back to the details of that. My impression, though, in the literature, and I have had sort of a political academic disagreement with some authors for another forest carbon project on the voluntary carbon market, but there's sort of I guess for that specific example about encroachment, it's a complicated issue, and the literature on climate finance and conflict kind of tends to pin the responsibility of conflict on the climate finance entrepreneurs, project developers. And I guess just the encroachment issue in public lands in Uganda is highly complex. It's highly historical. And I think it's, there's sure the project developers probably could have done a better job. But there's just all sorts of historical legacies of bad governance. Uganda had a major civil war for conflict for over a decade, which allowed for this forest reserve to kind of fall in disarray, and most forest reserves across Uganda. So that's a kind of an issue too. So I guess I would just kind of give maybe a bit more equilibrium on who's responsible for the conflicts and kind of recognizing also their complex and historical nature. For Trump, yeah. Well, I think it's just indicative of this kind of movement away from neoliberal globalization. I don't think Trump is a neoliberal. He's not a globalist. And we see this emergence of economic nationalism. I think, whatever the U.S. does, I think I saw, Bloomberg is committed to at least funding the U.S. Contribution to the UNFCCC, operationalization of that organization, the trillions and billions of dollars that we're also talking about. I'm not sure. I don't think Trump is going to be producing this. But I think my emphasis is just like, it's not really so important where the money comes from, but how the countries receiving it govern create management and governance structures for that finance, which is important. So yes, Trump is super important. It's probably going to major challenge for ramping up the financing necessary for climate change mitigation adaptation globally. I mean, $300 billion isn't the new promise at COP20 from COP29. That's maybe only a quarter of what's necessary, right? So we're talking about $1.3 trillion. So definitely problematic. There might be some interest in what's going on in the voluntary carbon markets. And one interest I have is whether there's sort of, with how the new rules around Article 6, whether they're going, of the Paris Agreement, whether those are going to kind of promote some synergy between the compliance markets and the voluntary carbon market. And we have some things like the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon market and things like this that are maybe trying to kind of wrap their arms around all the kind of Wild West kind of approach to climate governance and voluntary carbon market, and kind of maybe introduce some standardization and maybe convergence with what we see as best practice of the UNFCCC. Anyway, so a lot of questions about what the impact of Trump is going to have, but I think the key issue is how things are unfolding in countries, developing countries themselves. The methods, the methods I think is really important. Maybe briefly, the CDM, as I indicated, I bought a car, drove around. It was, it's lots of fun when you're like doing your PhD research and you can kind of drive around and explore. But for the CDM, essentially what I did is I looked at the project documents that describe the projects in detail. And all of those project documents sort of make a claim as to how unique that project is in their local context, but they don't describe the context. And so the one example of, the forest carbon CDM project in Tanzania, which was eventually not accepted under the CDM, if I understand correctly, maybe got accepted under the voluntary carbon market. But to get to that project, which is sort of, they're planting these kind of virgin kind of grassy hills, and a very picturesque part of Iringa region in central Tanzania, and a beautiful escarpment. But that escarpment also hosts Tanzania's national forest plantations, and you drive through them, and you're driving through them because they look like trees and conifer trees we have here in Canada. It's just like, it's surreal. But you're driving through those plantations for like maybe an hour before you can get to this open vista, and that's where they're claiming the tree plantations. And so in the book, I kind of look at the history of those tree plantations in Uganda, in Tanzania. And there's an interesting history with relationship with Tanzania's largest pulp and paper mill, which is sort of built in the 1970s, and in the vicinity of those paper mills, of those forest public state-owned tree plantations. And you can kind of gauge how the economic context has shifted. And there's a bit of a history of that forest plantation. So that's the example of the CDM. For RED, because they weren't being implemented, there wasn't really anything to investigate. RED, I wasn't looking at RED CDM projects. There are a few voluntary carbon market projects in Tanzania, not so many in Uganda, maybe one or two. But I was looking on RED at the national level, implemented on the UN. And I would do a deep dive into the technical parameters of how they actually are going to measure emissions. And I think Tanzania and Uganda, they produce forest reference emission level, which is essentially the baseline against which forest reductions are to be claimed. And you can kind of look into that and try and gauge how effective it's being implemented. And also the partners, the development partners that they've partnered largely with. And, Tanzania went with UN RED, and Uganda went with the World Bank Forest Carbon Partners Facility, which has a lot more comprehensive operational kind of detail on how to implement RED and operationalize the baselines and policy instruments. And also just the last issue was what type of data is being collected. And one of the big issues with RED is drivers. If you can have information on the drivers of deforestation, which is something that was being collected in Uganda and not really being collected in Tanzania. So that's sort of a way of gauging how effective those policy instruments were being.
Thank you very much. It is a really interesting book, and I encourage the audience to pick it up and dive into some of these things. But unfortunately, we're out of time for today. So I would like to once again thank our guests, Mark Purdon and Sarah Thompson, as well as all of you in the audience for taking part in today's webinar. Before leaving you, I would just like to remind you that our webinar series, our winter-spring schedule has been posted on our website, eu-renew.eu. Our next one is coming up in February with Sung-Yun Cho on investing the ASEAN way. And then we'll have Hilke Dijkstra, Petra Mavroidis, Wolfgang Weisch, and Cornelia Fricolida coming up later in the spring. You can sign up for those at eu-renew.eu. So once again, thank you for joining us today, Mark and Sarah. It's a pleasure to have you here. And thanks to the audience as well.
Thank you very much.
See you next time.
Bye-bye.